This podcast contains disturbing content that some listeners may find upsetting. The following episode includes descriptions of true crimes, violence, and discussions of serial killers. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you're sensitive to these topics, you may want to skip this episode.
I got something super wild for you today, Lena, and this one's going to be intense.
Oh my God, you have no idea how excited I am to get into this one. Like, when you mentioned we were covering this case, I literally spent hours, and I mean hours, diving into all the details.
Well, for our listeners tuning into Behind the Bloodstains today, we're heading up to Alaska, and this is not your typical true crime story.
Not at all. We're talking about Robert Hansen, who was known as the Butcher Baker. And let me tell you, this guy, right, he basically turned Alaska into his own personal hunting ground. And I mean that literally.
I've got to say, when I first started reading about this case, the whole thing it really threw me for a loop. Like, this guy owned a bakery?
Yeah, exactly. Like, here's this guy running this totally normal bakery in Anchorage, right? And behind the scenes, well, let's just say he was doing something way, way darker than baking bread. And you know what's really crazy? This was all happening in the 70s and early 80s when Alaska was like, basically the Wild West.
That's exactly what makes this case so chilling, isn't it? I mean, how do you even begin to track someone down in a place that massive?
Trust me, we're going to get into all of that. And some of the details, they're going to absolutely blow your mind. So, Robert Hansen was born in Estherville, Iowa in 1939, right? And his early life was honestly pretty rough. His dad owned this bakery, and that's actually where he learned the whole baking thing. But man, growing up was not easy for him.
What made it so difficult for him?
Well, first of all, he had this really severe stutter. And I mean severe. It was so bad that he basically became this total outcast at school. Kids were just absolutely horrible to him, you know what I mean? And he completely withdrew into himself.
That must have been really tough to deal with as a kid.
It was, and here's where things start getting really dark. So instead of trying to make friends or whatever, Hansen started developing these really concerning behaviors. He started getting really, really into hunting, right? But not in a normal way. He would spend hours and hours alone in the woods, and he started showing this really intense fascination with weapons.
Were there any early signs that things might escalate?
Oh my God, yes. So in his teenage years, he actually started setting fires. He became this serial arsonist, and this was just the beginning. He burned down this school bus garage, and get this, he actually ended up doing time at the Iowa State Reformatory for that.
Well, that seems like a pretty big red flag.
Exactly. And what's really disturbing is that after he got out, things they got worse. He got married super young, right, to this local girl. But the marriage was it was absolutely terrible. He started getting arrested for petty theft. And there were these accusations of assaulting young women. But because this was the 60s, and you know how things were back then, a lot of this stuff it kind of got swept under the rug.
So all these warning signs were there.
They totally were. And here's the thing that really gets me. All of this, everything I just described, it was basically this perfect storm. You've got this isolated kid who's dealing with this severe stutter, who's being bullied, who develops these really concerning behaviors, and instead of getting help, he just keeps spiraling deeper and deeper into this really dark place. And all of this, it's like laying the groundwork for what he would eventually become in Alaska. So, after all that trouble in Iowa, Hansen decided he needed a fresh start, you know? And Alaska in the 1960s was exactly that kind of place. It was this perfect spot for someone wanting to just completely reinvent themselves.
How did he end up setting himself up there?
Well, get this. He actually used all those skills he learned from his dad's bakery, right? He opened up this place called the Peccary's Bakery in Anchorage, and it became super successful. I mean, we're talking about this guy who everyone in town knew as just the local baker.
So he managed to build a pretty normal-looking life there?
Oh my God, yes! That's what's so incredibly disturbing about this whole thing. Like, he had this wife, Darla, and they had these 2 kids, and they lived in this nice house in Muldoon. He was like this pillar of the community, right? People would come into his bakery, and he's there making these amazing pastries, and everyone just thought he was this totally normal family man.
Did anyone ever suspect that something was off about him?
Well, that's the thing. During the day, he was this completely different person. Like, he'd be there in his bakery, serving customers, being super friendly, right? But then, and this is where it gets really chilling, he had this whole other life. He was actually a really skilled pilot and hunter, and he would take these hunting trips that no one really questioned.
How did he manage to keep these 2 lives so separate?
First of all, Alaska in the 70s was it was perfect for someone like Hansen. I mean, you've got all this vast wilderness, right? And back then, people they didn't ask questions. Like, if someone said they were going hunting for a few days, that was totally normal.
And his family never suspected anything?
So here's the really twisted part. He was apparently like this totally different person at home. He could be really controlling with his wife, but in this very, quiet way. And he had this trophy room in his house where he kept all his hunting prizes and, well, we'll get to that later because that becomes really important. But the thing is, he was so good at compartmentalizing. Like, during the day, he's this baker, this family man. But then there was this other side to him that nobody saw.
That must have taken a lot of planning and self-control to maintain that kind of double life.
Exactly. And you know what's really creepy? He actually became pretty well known in the community for his hunting skills. Like, he would give these talks about hunting, and he even set some hunting records. So when he would go off on these trips, nobody thought anything of it. It was just Bob the baker going off on another hunting adventure, you know what I mean? But the reality of what was actually happening during those trips, it's absolutely horrifying.
So what exactly was he doing on these hunting trips?
Oh God, this is where it gets really, really disturbing. So, Hansen had this whole system, right? He would specifically target sex workers or dancers because, and this is so calculated, he knew that if they went missing, people might not notice right away, you know?
How would he actually get these women?
So he would usually approach them in his car, and he'd offer them money for a photo shoot or something similar. But once they got in, that's when things turned absolutely terrifying. He'd pull out a gun, and he had this whole kit prepared, handcuffs, rope, that kind of stuff.
And then what would happen?
So this is it's just awful. He would take them to his plane, right? And the whole time they're bound and terrified, and he would fly them out to these remote cabins he knew about in the wilderness. And here's the thing that's it's beyond horrifying. He wouldn't just kill them. He would actually release them into the wilderness.
Oh God. You mean he actually?
Yeah, exactly. He would give them a little head start, and then he would hunt them like actual prey. He'd track them through the wilderness with his hunting rifles. These women, they're out there in the Alaskan wilderness, probably freezing, completely terrified, and they've got this monster pursuing them.
Were they wearing anything specific? Could they survive out there?
That's another part that shows just how sadistic he was. He would sometimes let them keep their clothes, but other times, he would make them take some or all of their clothes off. In Alaska. Can you imagine? And these women, they had no survival training, no knowledge of the area, nothing. They were completely helpless out there.
The isolation must have been
absolutely perfect for what he was doing, right? These areas he chose, they were so remote that even if these women somehow managed to survive and try to find help, there was nowhere to go. Can you imagine? You're running for your life, knowing that he's out there looking for you?
And he was a skilled hunter?
Oh, absolutely. Hansen spent years tracking and hunting moose and bears in the Alaskan wilderness. He knew how to move through rough terrain, how to follow tracks, and, just as terrifying, how to make sure no one could track him.
How many times does this?
The official count is Well, we know about 17 women for sure, but investigators think there were probably more. Like, way more. And the thing that's it's so chilling, is how methodical he was about the whole thing. He actually had maps where he marked the locations of his victims with little X's, like it was some kind of twisted game to him.
Can you tell me about some of the victims? Were there any who managed to, survive?
Yes, and thank God they did, because they were absolutely crucial in bringing this monster down. The most well-known survivor is Cindy Paulson, and her story is it's absolutely incredible.
What happened with her?
So, Cindy was only 17 at the time, right? And Hansen, he abducted her in June 1983, and he did his usual thing, offered her money, then pulled a gun on her. But here's where things went different. Instead of taking her straight to his plane, he first took her to his house, and that was, actually, his big mistake.
His house? Why would he?
Well, he had this whole, torture room set up in his basement, and he kept her chained up there for hours, and he assaulted her repeatedly. But Cindy, she was incredibly brave and smart. While he was busy getting his plane ready, she managed to escape. She literally ran for her life, still wearing handcuffs, and flagged down a passing truck.
Did people believe her when she told them what happened?
That's actually one of the most frustrating parts of this whole case. Initially, some of the police were really skeptical, because she was a sex worker, and Hansen was this, respected businessman in the community. But there was this one officer, Detective Glenn Floth, who he knew something wasn't right. And there were others before Cindy, right? I remember reading about a woman named Teresa Flores, who managed to talk her way out of the situation. She actually convinced Hansen that she would keep seeing him if he let her go, and amazingly, it worked. But she was so terrified she left Alaska immediately after.
Were there any other survivors who came forward?
Yes, and their stories were they were absolutely crucial. There was this dancer named Lisa Futrell who had a really close call with him. And then there was, oh God, this is just awful. There was Joanna Messina. Hansen actually shot her, but she managed to escape and make it to a nearby house. But when she reported it, Hansen convinced everyone it was just a hunting accident, and he actually got away with it at the time.
Unbelievable. These women who didn't survive. Do we know who they were?
Yes, and it's important to remember them. There was Paula Goulding, Angela Fettern, Sherry Morrow. These were real women with lives and families, And the thing that it breaks my heart is that some of them still haven't been found. Hansen gave the police locations for 17 bodies, but they only found 12. Exactly. And when you look at the timeline and the patterns, investigators believe there were probably many more victims we'll never know about. The wilderness up there, it's vast and unforgiving and, well, it can hide a lot of secrets.
So, with all these women coming forward, how did they finally manage to catch him?
You know what's really interesting is that it actually took this perfect storm of different things coming together. You had Cindy Paulson's testimony, right? But what really broke the case wide open was when they brought in FBI profiler John Douglas.
The same John Douglas who, helped catch other serial killers?
That's exactly right. And when he got involved, he absolutely nailed the profile. He said they should be looking for someone who was an experienced hunter, someone who knew how to fly planes, and someone who'd probably been in trouble with the law before for sexual assault. And get this, he even predicted the guy would have a speech impediment.
That's incredibly specific.
Right? And it gets even better. So Detective Floth, he starts connecting all these dots, He notices that all these missing women had been last seen in areas where Hansen's bakery was making deliveries. And then they found out about Hansen's previous arrests for assault, which he'd managed to keep quiet about. But here's the thing that really sealed it. They got a warrant to search Hansen's house, and what they found was it was absolutely chilling.
What did they find?
So in his den, right, he had this trophy room. And we're talking about jewelry from his victims, newspaper clippings about the murders, and get this, He had this map, just a regular aviation map of Alaska, but it had these little X marks all over it.
Were those?
Yep. Those X's marked where he'd buried his victims. And when they found that map, it was like, that was it. There was no more denying what he'd done. They also found the .223 caliber rifle he'd used in some of the murders and various pieces of jewelry that victims' families later identified.
So, once they had all this evidence, what happened next with Hansen?
Well, on October 27, 1983, they brought him in. And it was actually kind of anticlimactic, you know? Like, here's this guy who'd been terrorizing women for years, and they just walked up to his bakery and arrested him.
Just like that? At his bakery?
Yeah, exactly. And get this. When they brought him in for questioning, he actually tried to play it cool at first. Like, he tried to maintain this whole respectable businessman facade. But when they showed him that map with all the X's, that's when things really started to change.
How did he react to that?
So the interesting thing is, he initially tried to deny everything, right? But Detective Flaude, he was brilliant in how he handled it. He started showing Hansen all these pieces of evidence one by one. The map, the jewelry, the gun, and then he brought up Cindy Paulson's testimony.
That must have been the breaking point.
Absolutely was. See, Hansen knew they had him and the floodgates opened, and what's really fascinating is that once he started confessing, he became almost mechanical about it. Like, he started describing these murders in this really detached way. He would point to those X's on the map and just calmly explain what he'd done at each location.
God, that's chilling.
It really is. And you know what's even more disturbing? When they searched his house more thoroughly, they found this hidden trophy room. Like a proper trophy room. We're talking about pieces of jewelry from at least 17 different victims, dozens of newspaper clippings about missing women, and get this, he had actually mounted some of his hunting weapons on the wall right next to these mementos from his victims.
Was his family aware of any of this? His wife?
That's the thing that's just... It's mind-boggling. His wife and kids had no idea, like none. He had this whole secret room that they never went into, and he managed to keep this whole other life completely separate from his family life. He was literally living this double life where he was, you know, this respected baker and family man by day, and this brutal predator by night.
So what happened during the actual confession? Like, did he show any remorse?
That's actually one of the most disturbing parts. During his confession, he was just so matter-of-fact about everything. He confessed to 17 murders, but he only really seemed concerned about what people would think of him. Like, he was more worried about his reputation than about what he'd done to those women, and when they asked him why he did it, he just said that he was righting a wrong. Can you believe that? Like he was somehow justified in what he'd done.
After all those confessions, what happened with the trial?
So, the thing is, there wasn't really much of a trial at all. Hansen actually ended up taking a plea deal, and this was actually pretty significant because it meant that the families wouldn't have to go through the trauma of a trial, you know?
What kind of deal did he get?
Well, he pleaded guilty to 4 murders, those of Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Andrea Altieri. And get this, he also admitted to several other crimes, including assault and kidnapping. The sentence was, well, it was basically 461 years plus life without the possibility of parole.
That's essentially forever.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? He actually served his time at Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. Like, the same state where he committed all these horrible crimes. And from what we know, he was pretty much a model prisoner. Can you believe that? This man who had done such terrible things just sat quietly in his cell for decades.
Did he ever speak about his crimes while he was in prison?
That's the thing. He basically just clammed up. Like, completely. He never did any interviews, never wrote any books, never really talked about what he'd done. And he actually died in 2014 at the age of 75 from natural causes, lingering health issues that just kind of caught up with him.
Did his family ever, speak out about everything?
His family they completely disappeared from public view. Like, they changed their names and just vanished. And honestly, who can blame them? I mean, imagine finding out that your father was this monster who'd been hunting women for sport. It's absolutely devastating.
Any of the evidence still around?
Actually, yes. The Alaska State Troopers still have that map with all the X's marked on it. And they believe there might be more victims out there that Hansen never confessed to. Like, there are some X's on that map that they never managed to connect to any known victims, you know? So there might still be families out there who don't know what happened to their loved ones.
Looking back at this whole case, it really changed how law enforcement deals with these types of crimes, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this whole horrible situation. Like, this case really highlighted the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, especially when they involve, women in vulnerable situations.
And the whole FBI profiling thing too, right?
Yes. John Douglas's work on this case was it was groundbreaking. And it really showed how valuable psychological profiling could be in catching these kinds of predators. Like, his insights were just spot on, you know what I mean?
God, this whole story is it's really stuck with me.
I know exactly what you mean. And the fact that this happened in such a remote place like Alaska just shows that these monsters can really be anywhere. Behind any normal-looking facade, right? Like, who would have thought that the local baker would be capable of such horrific things?
Well, thanks for sharing this story with us today, Lena. I think we both need a break after this one.
Absolutely. And to all our Behind the Bloodstains listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Next week, we're going to be covering another fascinating case that I know you're all going to be really interested in.
The world is full of shadows, and some monsters never make the headlines.
But here in the dark corners of history, their stories will be told.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with fellow true crime fans.
Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, behind every bloodstain, there's a story waiting to be uncovered.